And then too, I mentioned I like to get into people's personal history and find out how they kind of first got into the idea of putting their faith in hip hop music, and maybe what was your first attraction or song or album or artist that you heard and like, wow, that's impressive and that's something I can do and speaks to my culture. So what was kind of your first introduction to people using their faith in their music like this?
Man. Well, maybe Brian can answer this. Because I didn't know that there was Christian artists when I became a Christian.
Yeah.
You know, and so all I knew was to do what I used to do before, which was to write and vent and express and journal and figure stuff out by way of pen and paper.
Yeah.
It wasn't until much later where I recognized, there's a culture of people doing this already, like making much about the gospel of Jesus.
Yeah. Did you feel like you were alone for a while doing that? I've encountered that. A lot of people were like, man, I feel like I was the only one doing it, and then I discovered that there were others, and it really, helped me, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, all my friends were doing music.
Yeah.
They were all into hip hop, and so the motivation behind doing it was so that they might listen to me present the gospel, because they weren't going to hear me if I'm just like, hey guys, let me tell you about Jesus. You know what I'm saying? Let me explain something about Jesus. They'd be like, don't talk to me about that. But if I could present it in a medium that was palatable, a medium that they would listen to, if I was skilled enough to write it down to where they would give it a minute 30 seconds to listen to it, then that was the end goal. And I didn't realize that there was other folks doing it way better than I was doing it. But yeah, much later I found out, and I was like pointing folks to these guys are good.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Cortland, do you remember who you first heard or got introduced to?
DC Talk.
Yeah?
I mean, no, it's interesting for me because, like, my whole upbringing was based off of Christian music. So, that essentially was the only one I knew of at the time. I'm talking real young. So, but yeah, I mean, later on in my like middle school years, I started listening to a lot more other music and music outside of that. And then that's in the same time when I started wanting to do music myself. And so within our particular genre, at the time I didn't realize that there's like good underground Christian hip hop artists. And so honestly, like some of the first people that I was listening to was Braille and Lightheaded and Plato and Deep Space Vibe, Marzel.
Yeah.
Like all those dudes influenced me to actually start making music. And so it's just crazy, like how the Lord has kind of used that, and like just really that music came out at the time that it did, and motivated me in a way to want to create that music, in the sense that I knew that they were doing it ultimately not for themselves but for the glorification of God. And so that just influenced me to be like, I love this music and that's what I want to do. So I didn't make music before that because I didn't really have the right motivation, and I didn't realize that you could do hip hop and do it for that reason. So
yeah. What about you, bro? I know that you heard Lap Click early on. You even wrote a song where you kind of acknowledged some of the early Christians in hip hop that you heard about. So.
Yeah, I mean, when it was through a street preacher in Portland, Oregon, that I first heard the gospel around age 14, and I was just a radical hip hop head. I mean, I was in the day of cassette tapes and vinyl, and my bedroom had so many cassette tapes and records in it laying scattered across the floor. I mean, sometimes I would break tapes just walking into my room because they were just everywhere. And when I became a Christian, I became actually connected to Ill Trip from Lab Click. So one of my first exposures to Christian music was through having a relationship with Ill Trip of Lab Click, and Listener was also a part of Lab Click. So I didn't get to meet Listener because I lived in Oregon, but I started making music with Ill Trip. And then I was also exposed to a group called the Boogie Monsters. They put out an album called God Sound, and the fact that it had God in the title, I was like, oh, some Christian guys, and they were getting some shine. You know, they had videos out and things like that. So I was attracted and drawn to that. Eventually met a guy who had a few other tapes and got the Grits Mental Releases, you know, older record. And so I had some exposure, and a lot of the exposure I had, it wasn't necessarily the same type of style of hip hop, because I really grew up more of a fan of East Coast, you know, New York hip hop, and I didn't really know many of the East Coast artists or things like that. But my main exposure was Lab Click, Grits, and Boogie Monsters, and that's kind of where it started. And then from there, fast forward a few years when the internet started having more websites dedicated to Christian hip hop and stuff like that, I became exposed to more of it. Yeah, but I mean, I was just a radical hip hop head. So when I got saved, it was similar to what Thomas was talking about, where that was the means in which I expressed myself already. So to begin expressing my faith, it was a natural thing for me to do, whether or not I knew how to do it or if anyone else was doing it. But I was also fortunate to be around a few people that were doing it as well, and pointed me out, you know, exposed me to other people who were doing it. And I found that really encouraging, and helped me to realize, I guess, that this wasn't like a weird thing to try and do, you know, that it was actually already being done.
Yeah.
But I would say, you know, even from my perspective, it isn't even until about 3 or 4 years ago where I feel like the ultimate goal actually started beginning to be achieved in making the gospel known. And for so long there were so many divisions within Christian hip hop between different styles, you know, and so the same way that in secular hip hop there was like East Coast, West Coast, well, within the styles, the underground style of hip hop really wasn't known for making a clear presentation of the gospel, because our background was doing hip hop in such a manner where the skills and how skillful the artist was and how relatable they were was so important that it was really difficult to know, well, how do I make the gospel known? It was like, I can't just rap and quote John 3:16. Well, the reality is, for a lot of us underground guys, we weren't really educated in the faith, as familiar with it as we were with our personal experiences, the culture of hip hop, and so that stuff flowed out of us easily. But biblical truths about the manner in which God has revealed himself, that didn't flow out of us with as much creativity, I think, at times. And so it's just been recently that I began to learn how to still have the artistic bend that I've naturally had from being a fan of hip hop for so long, but also communicating the gospel and realizing that there is more depth to it than, you know, in fact, the gospel isn't just the manner in which I came to God. The gospel is the manner in which I continue to grow in Christ likeness, and I need the gospel constantly. It's not just a one-time thing. And so now the idea of communicating it creatively, I feel limitless within that. And so I see a lot of the barriers that I think that existed within the scene coming down, where, dude, you can have any style. You can have any style. It's not really about the style. It's about gaining an opportunity to present the gospel, to present the message and make it clear to whoever you might have influence in their lives, you know. And so that's been the development process, I guess, for me. And, you know, that was the thing. A lot of the guys who had explicit gospel messages, their music wasn't really my style, and yet at the same time I was increasingly encouraged by them because they were communicating something that I was so desperate for. And so I always felt myself in this tension where I'm like, I'm not dope enough to exist in this camp. I don't know enough to exist in this camp. So I'm in this weird middle ground. Like, Lord, you're gonna have to help me sort this out, you know. And the Lord has been really, really gracious. And these years in Humble Beast have been foundational in helping me to grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ, and to have a desire to communicate it with clarity. For the edification of the church and the evangelism of the lost.
Cool. All right, anything else, or just tell people to go to Humble Beast to find out more about y'all and get the music?
HumbleBeast.com, man, records that you can download on all types of electronic devices, you know. And if you're listening to it on a non-electronic device, I don't know what you're listening to it on. I don't endorse those type of listens. You know what I'm saying?